So last time we did a first pass at this argument for global skepticism. This time we're going to continue to discuss the argument. So the first premise has the form P. It's just in a single proposition. My perceptual experience doesn't support the claim that I'm not a brain in a vat over the claim that I am. The second premise has the form if P, then not Q. So if my perceptual experience doesn't support one claim over the other, then I have no evidence for one over the other. Therefore, we get the conclusion not Q. The third premise says, well, if I don't have any evidence like that, then I don't have any evidence at all. And that's the form if not Q, then not R. Therefore, you get the conclusion not R. The next premise here says, if I have no evidence, which is if not R, then I don't know, which is not S. Therefore, not S. And what I want you to see first is this argument is valid. So you have P. P gives you not Q, therefore not Q. Not Q gives you not R, therefore not R. Not R gives you not S, therefore not S. So if you're going to object to this argument, the objection can't be to the form of inference, because the form of inference is good. It's a valid argument. Each conclusion follows by a legitimate rule from the premises. So if you're going to object to the argument, you need to reject a premise. Put another way, if you're going to show the argument is unsound, you're not going to show it's unsound by showing it's invalid because it is valid. Instead, you're going to have to show it's unsound because it has a false premise. Maybe more than one, but at least one false premise. Well, here are these two here, 3 and 5, are what are called intermediate conclusions. They serve as premises in future arguments. So in order to get to 7, I don't know that I have a body, you use 5 and 6 as your premises. But 5 itself isn't really a premise. It's a conclusion of 3 and 4. And similarly, 3 itself isn't really a premise. It's a conclusion from 1 and 2. So if the argument's valid, you can't reject the intermediate conclusions because not directly, because they have premises supporting them. So we can kind of say, in order to reject this argument, you have to reject one of the basic premises, not one of the intermediate conclusions. And there are just the following as basic premises: 1, 2, 4, and 6. Those are the claims that are being taken for granted. So we can think of those, the argument is really working like this: 1, 2, 4, 6, therefore 7. My perceptual experiences don't support the claim that I'm not a brain in a vat over the claim that I am. If that's right, then I have no evidence that I'm not a brain in a vat. But if I don't have any evidence like that, then I don't have any evidence at all. And if I don't have any evidence at all, then I don't know. Therefore, I don't know. So which of these premises might you reject? You might say something along these lines. There's a few different possibilities. You can actually reject any of them, but I'll just give you some. To start, notice this. This argument doesn't prove that I don't have a body, that I don't know that I have a body. All it proves is that either I don't know I have a body or one of these premises is false. And it is a proof of that much because these premises guarantee that conclusion. So if these premises are right, this conclusion is right. Put another way, if this conclusion is wrong, then one of these premises must be wrong. So the argument is a proof that either 7 is true or one of the premises is wrong. Pollock and Cruz, the authors whom you were supposed to read, suggest that the rational response to any given argument is to weigh your confidence in its conclusion against your confidence in the conjunction of the premises. And they say in this case, you should be more confident that you have a body than you are in some of these premises. Accordingly, what they say at the end of the day is, even if you don't know exactly how to respond, you should reject 7 and reject global skepticism because the conclusion is sort of so outlandish and it's much more controversial, or should be in your mind, than the premises. Okay, so they think you should reject 7 and then go back and reject whichever premise is least plausible. Of course, you then, if you're going to be rational, have the burden of trying to figure out which premise is the least plausible. Maybe you think it's 1, maybe you think it's 2, maybe you think it's 4, maybe you think it's 6, but you want to investigate and try and find which premise you can reject. Okay? Their idea is that by explaining whatever's wrong with whichever premise you reject, you're going to learn something important about how knowledge works, about how justification works, about rationality, and so on. Well, what are we going to learn? If we reject 1, then we learn that perceptual experience can support one hypothesis over another, even if both hypotheses are consistent with how that experience seems to you. So 1 says your perceptual experience doesn't support one of these claims over the other. It doesn't support that you're a brain in a vat over the claim that you aren't. Well, why does it say that? it says that because your perceptual experience would be the same either way. So there's this underlying idea that if your perceptual experience would be the same either way, then it doesn't support one claim over the other. So if you end up rejecting one, then you have to reject that underlying idea and say, even though my perceptual experience would be the same either way, it actually supports one over the other. What about 2? Well, if you reject 2, then you learn that perception isn't our only kind of evidence. So 2 says, if your perceptual experience doesn't support one claim over the other, then you have no evidence. Well, maybe there's other kinds of evidence. Maybe intuition is a kind of evidence. Maybe rational insight is a kind of evidence. And if those are evidence, then 2 is false. So if you reject 2, you incur the commitment of saying, what's the other kind of evidence? Well, if you reject 4, then you may learn something important about what our concepts and terms refer to. Nothing about concepts such as body, the idea would go, imply that they can't apply in a brain in a vat world. So why do I say that? Well, look at 4. It says, if I have no evidence that I'm not a brain in a vat, then I have no evidence that I have a body. This rejection of 4 is kind of a difficult idea, and I would go into it in more detail because it's really interesting, except for this. At the end of the semester, the very last thing we do is look at a paper that does go into the rejection of 4 in great detail. So I'm just going to set that aside for now. So you don't need to understand the rejection of 4 for now. All you need to understand is if you reject 7, you're going to need to reject one of those. And at least for some of these, you need to understand that by rejecting them, you can learn something about the nature of rationality. And if we reject 6, then we learn that we can know some claims even when we have no evidence that can support them over competing claims. So the idea here is that justification isn't limited to evidence. And typically people who advance that kind of line say that there are sort of pure rational procedures like appeals to simplicity, for example, that don't, you can have 2 hypotheses, the evidence fits well with both of them equally, but one hypothesis is simpler than the other, and that can be a reason to prefer it. Okay. That's the end of the discussion of global skepticism. Next time we'll talk about Hume on induction. That is his skepticism about a particular form of inference called induction, which we had talked about earlier.